Welcome everyone. I am Marianne Cosgrove, Acting Chair of Humanists Australia. Today is Activism Day, the final day of Launch-a-Palooza, a series of events celebrating the launch of Humanists Australia. Before we begin this session, I wish to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land and that sovereignty was never ceded. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. It's important that we remember whose land it is on which we tread, treat them respectfully as equals, and speak up when we see them suffering from injustice. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be made available to the public through the Humanists Australia YouTube channel and other media. Please keep your video camera off if you're concerned for your privacy. Dr Arnagretta Hunter is a physician and cardiologist. She understands medicine through our human biology, the social determinants of health, and the broader environmental context. She also has interests and qualifications in political science. She writes and speaks about health and climate change with work through the ANU Climate Change Institute and as ACT Chair for Doctors for the Environment Australia. She's a member of the Climate and Health Alliance, a coalition of health carers who work together to see the threat to human health from climate change and ecological degradation addressed through prompt policy action. Today, Arnagretta is speaking to us in her role as Chair of the Commission for the Human Future, a body of researchers and concerned citizens dedicated to finding and developing solutions to one of the greatest challenges in human history, the combination of catastrophic global threats that now confront humanity. Please welcome Dr. Arnagretta Hunter.
Thanks, Marianne. It's really great to be here, and I just wanted to congratulate you all on the launch of Humanists Australia. It looks like it's going to be a fantastic organisation. I'm really proud and very pleased to be part of the Launch-a-Palooza. It's a fantastic name for a series of events. And I look forward to having a look at some of what you've learned in the last couple of days. I've got a little PowerPoint thing just so I can remember what I'm talking about. And I will try and get that up. Where are we?
You got the green share button in the
Yeah, I've got the green share button. It's just not detecting that my PowerPoint is open. Just give me 1 second. Close that. All right, let's try that again. There we go. Done.
Yes, we can see your slides now. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, activism in the human future. It's an interesting set of talking points and discussion. I thought I might just start by reflecting on 2020. Like most of us, we've all learnt, I think, a tremendous amount in 2020. We've learnt about bushfires and bushfire smoke. We've learnt about extreme weather, about viruses and viral transmission, herd immunity and intensive care. We've learned what happens when we care for each other in society and what happens when we don't. In 2020, most of us have at some point or other felt under threat from either a natural disaster, from economic precarity, or from threatened or actual ill health. This year, it makes sense to talk about catastrophic and existential risks. And I remember when the Commission for the Human Future began at the end of 2019, sitting with my colleagues in a room at ANU, talking about the framework that had been developed for discussion at the Commission for the Human Future, and wondering how much of it was going to be relevant. But 2020 has really reminded me about the tremendous importance of recognising interrelated, interdependent risks, about the biological and environmental and technological threats that are faced in the world. And it makes so much sense in 2020, perhaps more than any year previously, for us to really be talking about what the human future is and how we can make it as good as we possibly can. So as Marianne started with, I'll just introduce myself again. My name is Arnagretta Hunter and I'm a cardiologist. I'm a physician. I work on the health impacts of climate change, and I'm also trying to get better understandings of how social transformations can significantly improve our human well-being. I've also been lucky enough to become the chair of the Commission for the Human Future. We are a group of concerned citizens and academics, largely academics, and students and other engaged humans who are quite concerned about catastrophic and existential threats that are faced by humanity. And so in 2020, it's been the most extraordinary year for talking about catastrophic and existential risk. What do we mean by that? Well, catastrophic and existential risks fall into three different camps. One is the environmental threats such as climate change, food and water scarcity or contamination, and our shrinking biodiversity or biome, global biome. There are also biological threats, and one of those biological threats is the pandemics. And the global pandemic, I think understanding the implications of a global pandemic has become very easy for us now. There's quite a lot of modelling work that looks at the risks of either naturally occurring pandemics like we have with the coronavirus infection this year, or the potential for a man-made or a laboratory-designed biological threat from a global infectious agent. And of course, along with those, the risk of pandemic come the risk of nuclear and other catastrophic war. Technological threats are also, I think, much more actively discussed in 2020 or in the last couple of years. I think there is a growing understanding and awareness that of unregulated artificial intelligence as a risk to how humans interrelate and to our human future. But I think it's also important to start by defining what it is that we mean by catastrophic or existential. I think the easiest way to understand it is that catastrophic risks are very bad and existential threats end humanity. And so if we go through the list of potential threats, there's actually quite a lot of debate in the literature, but I think it's generally regarded as a true statement that both climate change and nuclear war are existential risks, things that can actually wipe all of us out. Now, there has to be a possibility of an infectious vector which really does end humanity, but we haven't seen one yet. And that the other risks are really catastrophically bad, but unlikely to see humanity as a species demise. So that's the framework of the Commission for the Human Future. Apart from one other threat, and one threat that is discussed occasionally in the literature, which is that human behaviour and whether or not it is a risk in itself. We all have pretty human responses to risks and to threats. And again, I think 2020 has given us a textbook example of what happens when humans and civilizations and communities and regions are threatened by infection or by economic destitution. So we all have these very innately human responses to risk in the world around us. And so the response that we offer can also be a risk. And I think we see that play out, at least partly in the politics around coronavirus all over the world, even here in Australia. We might underestimate risk, probably something I see in medical practice not infrequently, where a risk of 2% seems like a very small number, but when you look at that on a population basis, it's a really big proportion of the population that can be threatened. And how we understand and discuss risk, I think, really has evolved over 2020, but might require a little bit more work. We do tend to believe that we can contain things. So you can see with coronavirus at the moment, we've got really serious hope. And I join the hope that the vaccine makes all the difference and we can contain the risk. And I think we see it similarly in the climate change sphere, that we have a hope that by undertaking an energy transition, that will be sufficient, that we can contain this, that put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, perhaps with the carbon pollution that we've already emitted, that we can somehow contain this risk through probably an under-resourced change. We tend to believe that we can understand complex or new problems, probably with more certainty than we should, and having a circumspect approach to serious threats, again, I think is a wise one. But the other thing I've learned this year is that the appetite for talking about catastrophic and existential risk was much greater in 2019 than it is in the middle or particularly toward the end of 2020. Disaster fatigue is a very real phenomenon in our community. And so engaging people in constructive and transformational discussions about how to make a better human future, we really need to make sure that we can see some positivity through a prism of potential disaster and threat. The idea of interdependent, interrelated risks is a key one for the work of the Commission for the Human Future, but it's also key for anyone who's thinking and working about any of these really complex and difficult problems, problems like climate change, problems like global pandemics, problems of justice and equity. When we start to fiddle with one element of this, we can change other elements. And we see this with the pandemic, that all of us have stopped flying and therefore our carbon pollution from transportation's gone down. And yet our consumption of waste, which might pollute our planet, not necessarily causing climate change, but then increasing the risk to our water and food supply, has gone up. So there are usually pros and cons to most situations. And I think being able to take on board a complex grid of interdependent, interrelated risks is a very important part of contending with creating our best human future. So what are the drivers of change? And I have to say, having gone through and sat and had many conversations around the threats and the risks, I think this is where the exciting conversations come from. And I can see it very easily in the framework for Humanists Australia. What are the things that drive change? What are the sorts of policy and other changes we can achieve, either locally, federally, or globally, that will actually achieve the sorts of global changes that will be helpful to sustain the human future? And I think we see a number of ways in which we can drive change. We can drive change through society and engagement with society and working collaboratively with each other. I think economics is a clear driver for both magnifying and at contending with the sorts of catastrophic and existential risks that we face on a regular basis. Leadership and governance, again, I think we've had lessons in that this year. Leadership and whether we can take responsibility and really work with the information that's in front of us, particularly that when it's hard. And the leadership example that I think many of us might identify with this year would be something like the Andrews government in Victoria, who, regardless of where you sit on their approach, they took a scientifically informed view of approaching the coronavirus pandemic outbreak that they had there. And they stuck with a line, allowing both accountability, which means they will take responsibility for their action, but also creating, I think, quite a remarkable model for leadership in Australia. The way our culture, how we work with each other, how we interrelate and how we coexist is an important driver for change. And I think we can look at the sorts of tools that are in our pocket. And again, in 2020, imagination and communication have been really very important. Maintaining hope and allowing people to enjoy the process of transformational change is really important. Collaboration and communities. I think we're all seeing that our communities, when working together, look after each other, and when not working together, we see individuals and areas much more obviously threatened by either the climate change events unfolding around them or by other threats such as coronavirus pandemic. And I thought it was interesting just to have a look at the human values element. And I went through the values that are associated with the Humanists Australia of compassion, community, reason, diversity, resolve, integrity, culture, environment, and forgiveness. And it's a beautiful framework, I think, for thinking about transformational change. There's a group in Tasmania run by Dr Millie Rooney called Australia Remade. And Millie and her group have done a lot of collaborative and community engagement discussions to come up with what they describe as the 9 pillars. The first of the 9 pillars is the first people's heart, and in recognising the role of the Indigenous heritage in places like Australia. The second pillar is the natural world for now and for the future. The third, an economy for all people, society where all contributions count and every job has dignity. A diversity of people living side by side, countries of flourishing communities, a new dawn for women, a thriving democracy, and a proud contributor to a just world. I think both of these are really quite helpful frameworks and often very inspirational frameworks for how we might be able to achieve change for a better human future. So I thought I'd reflect a little bit on some of the work I've done this year. Back in February, the Commission for the Human Future brought together a range of experts who were expert on a range of catastrophic and existential risks. We had people whose expertise was in nuclear war, in artificial intelligence, in climate change, in water and food security, in global pandemics, and a lot of public policy expertise in the room as well. And we met, it was in March this year, or February, March, it must have been March, because it was at the last minute changed from a in-person meeting to a Zoom meeting. But it was before we were all deeply enmeshed, I think, in the coronavirus pandemic that's evolved in the last couple of months. And so it was an extraordinary meeting over several hours, and the report is well worth reading, called Surviving and Thriving in the Human Future. What did we get from this particular meeting? We talked about the need to communicate the risks, communicate the threat and risk model that I discussed earlier, and that engaging our population, our community, our friends, our colleagues into understanding the potential threats that will really have an impact on our human future has a tremendous importance to it. We need to work together to develop solutions. We need to recognise the importance of change and the potential opportunities of change. And again, when we're thinking about how we can communicate most effectively when talking about challenge and risk and bad things happening, really great example of this is thinking about the health co-benefits of acting on climate change. So there are such extraordinary opportunities to make our world healthier and happier by acting to contend with the model of threats. And I think opening up a global dialogue across the world is another important part of that Human Futures report from back in earlier this year. There are two things I've kept on coming back to. There was broad consensus across this really diverse range of people that the use of science in informing our policy decisions is important. And, you know, we were articulating this, I think, well before we recognised how important the scientific message was in contending with the global pandemic. And I think everybody recognises there's still this extraordinary gap between understanding the science of climate change, which we understand well, and seeing policy actions. So using science to inform intelligent public policy is a dominant theme through that report. But the second element was being able to facilitate a longer term horizon, stop thinking in months and years and begin to think in terms of decades and centuries. I think when we start to make decisions, not just for here and now, but decisions for the longer term, we make a much, much, much richer policy sphere. And so if you want any more information about that, that's the website for the Commission for the Human Future there. Interestingly, at the end of the year, so much has changed. And I did have the opportunity just recently to stand on a stage to give a speech, and I've reflected on it. I think it had been the first time since February that I'd managed to stand in a large auditorium. I was in the same auditorium. In February, there were 500 people in the room, and it was live streamed on Facebook. And in December, the event was attended by 40 people who were socially distant. And again, we had an online presence. And so there's been such a tremendous amount of change in terms of the way that we communicate. And so I've been part of this fantastic little series of podcasts through the Crawford School at ANU called Policy Forum. We've been thinking about significant change. And I don't think we would have been asking these sorts of questions if it wasn't for the challenges that have been faced over 2020. And so these are some of the positives that come from a really difficult year. I think 2020 has upended so many of the assumptions about how policies can work in Australia and around the world. And the primary question that we've been exploring across a whole series of podcasts now is how economic change can solve complex problems like climate change, like poverty and inequality, like global transformation, and some really practical ideas about how to achieve change, talking to people who are working on the ground with communities. And if you want any more information about that, that's the website as well. So when we approach solutions, complex problems, existential problems, they're often wicked and they're difficult to explain in good one-liners. But the solutions to risks really come through human behaviour. And I think recognising the power we can have by working and crafting societal change, cultural change, economic change, governance change is all very real. Finally, at the beginning of this year, I started telling a story. I remember sitting in at the Climate Emergency Summit in Melbourne back in February. And it had been a really grim summer. So for those of you who are located in the ACT or New South Wales or Eastern Victoria, you understand what I'm talking about. 2019 was potentially one of the worst environmental years on record anywhere. Devastating drought, the creeks that dried up and the rivers that stopped flowing, had towns without water. And that was before the bushfires began, of course, affecting such a huge proportion of the Australian biosphere. So many millions or billions of animals that have been killed or injured, tremendous loss of our natural environment, and the human health impacts as well are significant. 12, perhaps 15 million Australians exposed to bushfire smoke. Almost all of us in this region had experiences over the summer period that could be described as apocalyptic, and certainly got many of us thinking deeply about that human future question. And so I was thinking, sitting in Melbourne, climate emergency discussion, the need for radical transformation and change to contend with the climate emergency around us was the dominant topic of conversation. And I'll confess, I felt like I was sitting on top of a cliff. It was an extraordinary process of thinking how quickly we need to see carbon pollution reduced, how quickly we need to achieve societal and structural change. And it's an overwhelming challenge that we were facing. I thought, how could we possibly change so many elements of our life as it stands now in such a short period of time? The way I've been thinking about 2020 is that it's like the hang glider came along, or maybe we're just still in free fall. We're off the edge of that cliff. We're spending a tremendous amount of time thinking about the structures of our society, thinking how we work, how we play, how we care for each other, what the meaning and the purpose of our economic structures are, how we value for those who care for each other, and how we might be able to restructure and rebuild in a better way, rather than going back to the old normal, that the new normal may offer us the most extraordinary human future. And so it's an extremely exciting time for Humanists Australia to be launching. I commend you again on the organisation. And I think that this is the time for us to really offer options for transformational change. 2020 has given us challenges and threats that we've never experienced before, and I'd be cautious about whether we might not see the same sorts of challenges through 2021. It's also given us more opportunities than previously imagined, and I'm sure that those opportunities for conversation, for collaboration, for imagination will continue to resonate through 2021 and beyond. I know that together we can craft a human future that is healthy and sustainable and really quite amazing. These are essential and extraordinary times for our imagination, and I hope that to continue the conversation. Thanks again for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you so much, Arnagretta. Would anyone like to ask questions? Please raise your hand or put your name in the chat. I will acknowledge you in the chat if I see your hand raised. Liz.
Thanks for a great talk, Arnagretta. I wanted to ask you how much you come across in all your talking with people, how much you come across, how would you put it, the feeling that this is all too hard, we're doomed anyway, there's no point doing anything. And if you do, is that kind of doomsday thinking more in a particular age groups?
It's a really great question. And I'll start with your last bit first. I don't think that's age specific. I think we can see people really wanting to disengage with this question across the spectrum. And look, I confess, I think it's hard to talk about catastrophic and existential risk right now when we've all, I think the idea of disaster fatigue is highly relevant for almost all of us. And yet it is tremendously important that we manage to discuss things, and getting the balancing act right between disaster threat and the end of the world and the potential for transformational change and real hope for a better future. It's a balancing act. I don't think there's one message to fit everybody. I'm increasingly convinced that really we need a series of different narratives that will engage with a very broad spectrum of society. There's no doubt that there are people who enjoy the disaster framing, and really, you know, that whole emergency driver is a really effective mechanism. That I think is an older population. I think the emergency framing comes from an older population. And the transformational hope group, I think, are maybe a little bit younger, but again, you see a lot of diversity in both of those ends of the spectrum. And I'm talking, that's largely about through my climate change experience. I think when we start to put together, and so the Commission for the Human Future in its first iteration at the beginning of the year, we had a very rigid idea of 10 particular threats. And I think all of those threats have tremendous merit. But I think it's easier if we can compartmentalise it into environmental, biological and technological. I think that becomes less overwhelming and confronting. And we can be really specific about that threat model for people who want more information. But it just makes it a little bit less confronting for those of us who don't need one more disaster or 15 more disasters in our week when we've already had the 3 that are in front of us. So there's some of the ideas that I've had from those conversations. Mostly, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach to this particular communication.
Melissa's next.
Hang on. Am I muted?
No, we can hear you, Melissa.
Oh, okay. I thought I was muted. Under pandemics, I just wanted to ask about non-infectious pandemics. So pandemics of obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer, and dementia.
Yep. No, the chronic non-communicable diseases with which I spend professionally a lot of time.
Yes. They're a slow-moving pandemic, and I think a lot of people really don't realize, because it's happening over the time course of a couple of centuries. And people think it's only a bit worse than it was in their parents' generation. And that's sort of right. But if you look at the overall trajectory, it's just horrifying.
Maybe the thing to talk about here is actually an idea about the velocity of change. And I think we really easily engage with disasters that have a quick velocity. So when the fire's coming down the road, we're happy to engage with that. As the pandemic, and we're watching the front page of the newspaper every day, and the numbers are going up and the curves are really impressive, we can see that velocity. We see it. It has meaning in our lives. It works in a very human time frame of days, weeks, and months. The climate change disaster evolves over years and decades, potentially millennia. And so I think that's much more difficult. It's much harder because what we do now doesn't influence tomorrow. Like with the pandemic, you know that if we behave, if we have a socially distant and a lockdown mechanism during a really severe outbreak of an infectious pandemic, that we can control that pandemic in whatever the time frame of the virus is. It's a virus-dependent variable. And so we can see it in front of our eyes, and we can see that, understand that sort of time frame. Whereas the actions that we can do for climate change now will influence our children and our grandchildren's future, as well as probably our own. No, the chronic non-communicable diseases is a really interesting framing, and whether or not it's a catastrophic or existential risk, I think, is a difficult question. I'm certainly interested in it from a health perspective, and that's one of the places where you see these extraordinary co-benefits of action on things like climate change, because it contends with those sorts of ongoing health threats as well. And so
one thing about these diseases is, if people come to see them as a slow-moving pandemic, rather than a natural and normal state of affairs that we just have to cope with, then it's potentially powerful, because most of the population in most developed countries, most of the population would have someone in their family already affected.
25%
so it's very personal.
Adult Australians have type 2 diabetes. It's 25%, something like that. We have an extraordinary rate of it's 50% of either obese or overweight in our population.
Yeah, so if you add all these things together, the dementia, the colorectal cancer epidemic, there will be very few people who don't have an affected individual in their family.
What are we going to die from?
Yes.
Yep.
So I'm just saying it's, people don't see it as a pandemic, but actually it's a pandemic that's already touched nearly all of us.
Yep.
So if we saw it as one.
It's a really interesting question.
Then
And
we
I can see there's a question in the chat box about population, and population's a fascinating question. It's a really interesting set of conversations and debates. And yes, there's this the ongoing projected increase in global population. And is that a catastrophic or an existential threat? Is that a driver for some of these threats that I was discussing earlier? Is it a threat or a risk on its own? There's a very broad spectrum of opinions on that particular point. I think it's a really interesting question, and I think we should be discussing it in an intelligent and informed way, and in a way that's respectful. And I often find myself aware of the social dynamics in this, that when we talk about population control, we're often talking about people in underdeveloped countries having population restriction. We're not really talking about our own lives and our own population quite often from a privilege of the white West.
We have to combine it with the footprint idea that.
Yeah, so that's one of the major problems is that
times the population.
I think talking about consumption is a really useful framing, that our individual consumption, certainly in countries like Australia, our carbon footprint and our consumption of stuff is bigger than it needs to be. We can still have a very happy and wonderful life without as much stuff and with a lower carbon and environmental footprint. And I think if we can build in a society that becomes increasingly aware of both the carbon and the environmental consequences of the life that we're leading, that has a flow-on effect to population signalling. And so that would be one of my conversations. It's interesting when you read the climate change literature, because the climate change literature has been quoting a tremendous mortality risk from climate events, from extreme weather events over the coming 100 years. Some climate scientists have made population estimates over by 2100 that the sustainable population on the world will be around 1 billion people. And so that's a pretty significant social shift that's in front of us between now and 2100, which may not be in any of our lifetimes, but it's certainly in the lifetime of our children or grandchildren. And so that's an interesting framework for what I hope to be diverse discussion. Yep, climate may drive wars, absolutely. Yep.
Sue, you had your hand up next.
Thank you. Yes, and thanks, Arnagretta, for a terrific and very inspiring sort of talk. And I love that. I love the idea that we look at risk and significant catastrophic risks. Also through the lens of finding, using imagination, collaboration, all those other things, the drivers for change as well as the drivers of risk. And for me, it seems to be sort of resonating with a whole range of other kinds of things that I think are happening in the human community, looking at more hope-focused approaches to finding solutions rather than problem solving, looking at imagination and envisaging to actually come up with different ways of doing. I'm thinking the risk and resilience research that's happened over the years, movements through appreciative inquiry, asset-based community development, and even narrative therapy, all those sorts of areas seem to be looking at, okay, how do we fan and flame the positive ways forward, or the hopeful ways forward in terms of what we can do about these things. So do you see those sorts of links as well? Have you come across that sort of
so I have an interest in narrative medicine. I think stories are probably what keeps us together as humanity, actually. I'm increasingly convinced by that, and I'm very interested in this tension in climate change and in other areas. You see it in coronavirus, between the scientific solution at one end and the messiness of humanity at the other. That our behaviour and our desires and the way that we all work together doesn't always fit with the models that are developed in the laboratory or on a piece of paper. And so the way that we can craft that is by using narrative. I'm struck that even in the Royal Commission for National Natural Disasters, that they're calling for imagination, that some of this scenario planning work that really needs to be done in Australia, and that's not inspirational in terms of hope. That's just simply saying, how does Australia look when you've got a 3-degree summer, and how can we better prepare ourselves for that sort of environmental event? And that tests our imagination in an extraordinary way. So these are skills that are beyond the standard climate modelling. It's how does the landscape look? How do you go outside? How do you interact on a social basis? Can you work? How can you get food? All of those sorts of really interesting questions that start to come up. So when I think the most straightforward out of that threat model is potentially nuclear war. We could just get rid of nuclear weapons. That'd be fantastic. And the global treaty that's been finally activated has been a really significant move in that direction this year. But a lot of these threats come down to the messiness of humanity, how we work together, how we communicate with each other, how our societies coalesce. And so understanding that dynamic and working with that dynamic, often through storytelling and play, I think will be part of our solutions in the future.
Thank you.
I have a question, which is how can ordinary folks like us help persuade our politicians and broader society to take a longer term view, particularly when politicians only have a 4-year term in Parliament?
That's a really difficult one, isn't it? I find this challenging, and I still struggle with trying to work out why we haven't made as much difference, particularly in terms of climate strategy on a federal level. And so how did we do that on a local level? Because there are a lot of examples of hope, both at a local and at a regional level, ACT government, the climate strategy that we have here in Canberra, and of course in other parts of the country as well. And so I think that's through conversation. I think that's evoking our future. Many of us act because we care not just for ourselves, but for the community around us. And I think that should be the driver for our policy and decision making. That's my best answer to that question, because I can't come up with a better way to undermine that 3-year or 4-year mindset, particularly federally.
Ian?
Thank you. Hi, Arnagretta. It strikes me that a lot of us know that we should be doing something about this. A lot of us are becoming involved in organisations like Humanists and others because we understand that it has to start small, that individually we have to act, we have to work with other people, we have to network, we have to do something about it. But what gets in the way, I think my perception is that what gets in the way is fear. And it's not so much the fear of all of these existential threats, it's the fear of not knowing how, as an individual, we can affect change. So we listened to Tim Hollow yesterday talking about how we have to create local communities, and they have ambassadors who walk down the road to the next locality, the next block in a city centre, and they spread the gospel of, sorry, the wrong word. They spread the good work that they're achieving and the ideas. And so it spreads and so on. And I was thinking about this idea of, okay, so what do I do? It's all very well understanding what the problem, but how do I, as one person, affect change? And the thing that strikes me is, I think a lot of people are afraid of doing something because of that first step of knocking on the neighbour's door or dropping a note through a letterbox or writing to their member of parliament or whatever just seems too difficult. They're too afraid of rejection. They're too afraid of being thought of as a nutcase or whatever. It's really hard. And how do we, I'm interested in your thoughts about how do we as individuals affect change most effectively? How do we take that first step?
It's a fantastically important question. And I don't think I've got the one answer for that. I mentioned this policy forum podcast that I've been doing, and Tim Hollow and Mark Howden were on our episode where we talked about climate change and economics and how we can change our economic thinking. And I have to say, it's one of the best conversations about climate change I've ever been part of. Extraordinary thing. And no, we didn't talk about transitions to renewable energy particularly at all. We talked about deep societal change. Similarly, I had a conversation just last week with Millie Rooney and Carolyn Hendricks. Millie runs Australia Remade, and Carolyn Hendricks is an academic at ANU who understands and has done a lot of work on political change, like the Voices for Indi group down in Victoria, and the independence movement that's really grown from that Cathy McGowan, Helen Haynes experience. And they're two highlight conversations out of that series of podcasts. If you've got a couple of hours over the summer break, I'm really proud of it. So it's been a really interesting set of discussions, and there are some solutions in that framework. One of the things that Millie Rooney commented on was that communities need confidence that they will be looked after. And that one of the things that prevents us from engaging and prevents us from change is our precarity, either our economic or our social precarity, that we're not secure that we will be taken care of when something goes wrong. And I think there's something very powerful in that particular message. And so, look, maybe that's part of the solution, is that we need to work together. And doing these things, if you're going door knocking or you're trying to get your friends together, doing that with more than one of you is a much more powerful, even if there's just two of you compared to one of you, it's often a very powerful thing. And that's what we saw emerging, I think, down in the federal seat of Indi, is these kitchen table conversations and people coming into each other's homes. And I've spent some time down there, and yes, it actually happens in practice. And it really does, it opens some doors for people to talk to each other about the different issues that emerge. I think this problem in communication has been coming on, and there's a lot written about this over the last decade or so, but social media and the silos that we live in, and the change in how we relate to each other in terms of that human conversation in the same room, around the same table, in the same space, where we can potentially discuss the diversity of ideas and disagree, and actually nut things out in a way which is much more collaborative than when we're in our own silo and everyone's agreeing. And so how do we break down those silos again? How do we foster that? And I think it is about community building, either virtual community building or actual physical community building. They're my best guesses for how to overcome that.
That's why Humanists Australia has a strong focus on community building. And we heard at our community day yesterday, Tim Hollow speaking about the Indi project as well. Rod had his hand up next.
I did, but I was going to respond to Ian's to some extent, and Arnagretta's said a lot of what I was going to say about the value of working as a community. And as you said, Marianne, that's one of the focuses of Humanists Australia, and the way we're setting it up is to create communities that can support and strengthen people's confidence to go out and do those things. I think you're right that a lot of the time it is fear of rejection, but there's also, I think, the other side of it is that people often feel that they're just too busy and there's other more pressing problems, and it's hard to get over that hurdle as well. Yep. But the other thing that Humanists Australia is doing is setting up platforms that actually make it very easy to do stuff. It is so easy to put out a post and say, I'm going to run a meeting on Zoom next Friday at 5 o'clock. If you're interested in learning a bit about or talking about how we tackle such and such problem, come along. And people do, and it only takes 2 or 3 to get something rolling, and then you can move on from there. I've also found it. I've enjoyed, as I get older, and care less what people think about me. It's been great to be able to go and knock on doors too, and I haven't done it much physically,
but pick up the phone or chat to people and say, can we talk across this supposed gulf, between where you're sitting and where I'm sitting, and see if we can get somewhere with that.
Mm. I was just going to say the local global tension is also really interesting to me, and we can see work being done leading up to COP26, and there's all this stuff happening in the environment field globally, but a lot of it's going to come down to how communities respond at a local level. And in Australia, where we have this policy vacuum, perhaps to some degree, that's the local action that can bring people together, and that can really spark a transformational change, which is very, very real and very positive for that community.
We are providing some infrastructure to help with that kind of collaboration. The Human Union platform that Rod mentioned is an easy way to create campaigns and build on them and give people different options for contributing to those campaigns. We also have a workspace in the platform called Slack, which allows us to communicate nationally on a variety of topics in different channels. And we've created a space with the help of the platform called Notion, where communities and interest groups can create publicly visible web pages really easily for themselves. And they can create team spaces where they can collaborate together. So the technology is important too.
It is. It is.
We seem to have come to a natural end to the questions, so I will. I'd like you all to put your hands together to thank Dr. Hunter for her wonderful presentation, for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great to meet you all and to spend some time together this afternoon. Great conversations. I look forward to continuing it.
So this session concludes Launch-a-Palooza. I would love to thank everyone who has helped launch Humanists Australia, especially Launch-a-Palooza speakers, Andrew Copson, Fiona Patton, Tim Hollow, Lyndon Story, and of course Arnagretta Hunter, and also singer-songwriter Franciscus Henry. The activity panelists, Les, Rod, Debbie, Jeff, and Liz Foreman, who also ran the discussion activity. Community panelists, Alison, Les, Jeff, Alistair, and Stella. Community dinner organisers, Alison, Alex, Rod, Sue, and Stella, who also organised the printing and distribution of stickers with the generous support of Signarama in Hindmarsh. The Humanists Australia Working Group, Acting Secretaries Rod and Ian, Acting Treasurer Josie, Alistair, Alex, Tanya, Danny, and Stephen, and now Stella, who's representing South Australia as Tanya has stepped down, and all those who've sent submissions to the working group. Diana, Irwin, and the WA Humanist Society for their very generous donation. The publications team, Rosalind, David, Michael, Callum, Sue, and Melissa, and especially Australian Humanist editor, Elizabeth Dangerfield. Alistair, Danny, and Nikki, who've worked on the website, the community pages, and other technical infrastructure. The awards team headed by Jeff Alshorn. The marketing team, including Alistair for his work on the branding, and Josie, who created social media artwork. Sarah and Marcus Garrett, who are working on educational materials. And finally, everyone who has supported Humanists Australia by making donations or becoming members. The creation of Humanists Australia has been a huge collaborative effort involving many people. Please forgive me if you've helped and I've neglected to mention your name. Thank you for coming today. Videos of most Launch-a-Palooza sessions will be made available on our YouTube channel. Please join us or subscribe to our mailing list at humanistaustralia.org/home to receive notification when the videos are ready. I hope to see you at some of our events in the new year. Join our meetup group, meetup.com/humanists-australia, to be notified of upcoming events. Enjoy your end of year break.
And could I possibly just add, the biggest thank you I think must go to you, Marianne. None of what has been achieved, I think, would have been as far-reaching, as visionary, as creative, as fun and as effective had your involvement not been there. You've really been a driving force, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone associated with where we've got to now. We owe you a great debt and a huge vote of thanks.
Hear, hear.
Thank you so much, Ian. Farewell and see you in the new year.